Time doesn't erase murder. It just hides it better. They said the case was closed. They said no one was watching. But someone always is. This is Santana True Crime.
Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight we've got a great show. We've had a busy couple weeks over the holidays. We still have Travis Hunter, who is the football coach and has a $25,000 reward on the bounty for finding him. If a lot of y'all are not familiar with that case, his charges are related to child porn and having inappropriate relations with some of his students. So he's still missing. We also had JP Miller, who we did a show on the Michael Miller case. He is the one that's a pastor who started to groom children when they were younger, ended up marrying Micah, and he's finally indicted for cyber stalking and lying to the feds. It's great when you lie to the feds because they slap you with 2 years at least. So he's looking at 7 years, should be going to trial or his first appearance around January 12th. So we'll keep an eye on that for you. But the biggest news of all is the 1973 case of Debra Elizabeth Espey. That is from Niceville, Florida. Kind of ironic when your name is Niceville and you have an unsolved murder in it. But DNA has finally caught up with the suspect. So I'm joined here with the true crime professor, Dr. Brian Santana. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Lots of stuff going on this week.
Absolutely. So it's great that you've been researching this for a while and understand you're working on now an article on the case and maybe possibly a book.
Yeah, so I first discovered this case. It must have been 3 years ago or so. We were working on the Olson book, and one of the things that happens when you're writing or you're researching a true crime book is that you're kind of following both where the original investigation went, but you're also exploring our own theories. In our book, we talked about lots of other possibilities and theories that existed for the case. There was a suspect or a person of interest, not a suspect, a person of interest in the Olson case very early on that was traced back to Northwest Florida. And detectives from the SBI went down there or agents from the SBI went down there. And when I was trying to find media coverage, if there was any discussion of that interrogation in Florida newspapers, I came across this story of Debra Elizabeth Espey. And it caught my attention because she was also a 19-year-old college student like Virginia Olson, and her body was discovered 2 days after Olson's body was discovered. She went missing in March of 1973. Her body was discovered on April 17th in 1973, so 2 days after Olson. So this case caught my attention right away, and it's one that my students researched on 2 different occasions over the last few years.
Yeah, I feel like you're picking out cases where students are found in April and have connections to campuses, and that is your website that you can see the article on. That is briansantanaauthor.com, and also the book that we were referring to is A Murder on Campus: The Professor, the Cop, and North Carolina's Most Notorious Cold Case. So make sure you check both of those out. So Brian, let's go ahead and start with this case. Again, you said April 17th, 1973 is when they found a shallow grave in a wooded area in northeast Niceville, Florida.
Yeah.
Can you kind of set the scene for us?
Sure. So Debra Espey was a 19-year-old college student. She was taking classes at Okaloosa Walton Junior College. That college no longer exists now, by the way, but it was one that existed in the 1970s. And she was someone who was she had gotten a ride to campus with her brother that day, and she had an 8 a.m. class, and she wanted to take off after that. She had a class later that afternoon, but for whatever reason, she just maybe she just wanted to take a day off. I know I did when I was in college a few times, and she wanted to leave, but her brother had an exam and could not go home early. And so she said, "Don't worry about it. I'll just find a ride." She was known as someone who would occasionally kind of hitchhike. It sounds crazy to us now, but this was not uncommon in the 1970s. I think Ted Bundy probably spoiled that for a lot of people in particular, but hitchhiking around college campuses was not uncommon. But she was going to catch a ride. She never made it home. There was a missing person report that was originally filed on March 12th, 1973. They could not find her. There was a lot of interviews that were done. And then her body was ultimately discovered on April 17th, the following month.
So they do an autopsy.
Mhm.
And do you want to go through the results of the autopsy?
Yeah, so she had been bludgeoned to death, and she had been found near the side of a road. And this is she had been found in a shallow grave, as you mentioned, in a wooded area in the northeast section of Niceville, Florida. And it was on a dirt trail. The kind of case file describes it being on a dirt trail about 4/10 of a mile north of Rocky Bayou Road. And so she was about 456 feet, they said, like off the actual road. So they were able to identify her body fairly early on, despite the decomposition that had taken place, because shortly before she disappeared, she had actually been to her dentist. And so he had very, very recent records from her, like within weeks before that. So they were able to match her dental records really quickly, and that was how she was identified. And then that starts an entire chain of events that I know we talked about doing a show later on that will kind of do a deep dive into this case, because this is a case with lots of interesting turns, lots of suspects, and one that investigators had a very clear idea of who they thought was responsible early on. But for lots of reasons that we'll have to kind of talk about, an arrest didn't materialize. And through no fault, I should say, of the original agents who were working the case. So.
Yeah, and absolutely, we'll do a deep dive on this. I wanted to get it out because this just came out, and I didn't want to wait on it. I think when we're looking at these cases in the 1970s, people need to remember that this is not 2025, or 2026, I should say now.
Yeah.
And so you can't apply 2026 standards to 1973, but they did rely heavily on polygraph exams, as well as just doing old-fashioned police work, getting out to the community, asking people if they've seen her, and conducting interviews. And I believe you've got about close to 1,000 pages on this case, right?
Yeah, so my students, Florida is one of the states that has really transparent record laws. And so my students over the years have researched this case. I assigned this case to 2 different classes. So I've had about 20 students in total who have just focused for 4 months researching this case. And so over those 3 years that I assigned it, at my last university, they accumulated quite a bit of information associated with this case, and I've had some follow up reports that I've been able to get myself, that were kind of about the most recent activities in this case. But I was surprised by the news today, because the last update I was aware of was last January, so a year ago, that they had sent off some materials for DNA testing. And it was very complicated about it was hard to understand whether anything useful was going to come about from it, because there is some language that is used in the report describing that some of the materials, the DNA was degraded. They were able to get a full profile that was run through CODIS for one of the samples, and then some of the samples were commingled, and they give everyone a sense of how degraded some of the samples were. So they were able to extract some really good samples from some of the items, But in some of the other items that were like her clothing, even Debra Espey's own blood in one of the tests done by the FBI was so degraded they could not even detect her DNA. And so so I was not optimistic about this case, given that it had been run through CODIS. So the the um, the person responsible was likely at least not committing crimes in the 1990s and kind of onward, or not committing felonies. And so it wasn't clear to me how this was going to kind of work out. So I was shocked to see it pop up the other morning that the case had been officially closed.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget too that DNA is great, and don't get me wrong, it absolutely is, and it's going to solve a lot of cases. But you've got to take into those factors that you're talking about, where if items aren't stored properly, they dry out, they start to the liquid starts to dissipate, and the DNA disappears basically.
Mhm.
And also that when you've got these mixed samples, if it's two DNAs mixed together, you cannot put that into CODIS. And we
Mhm.
do not have a technology currently to unmix them. And you also cannot do uh, genealogical studies with it either. So you can do one-to-one comparisons
Yeah.
with mixed DNA, but that becomes a lot of legwork when you're looking at, piling on hundreds of people and tracking them down in these old cases that
Yeah.
are, 50 years later. People move. So you may have to go and chase down a suspect on the other side of the country.
And this is, and yeah, that exactly right. And it's also just that, yeah, this is not, they send it off and it's kind of done. Even when I'm looking at some of the testing right now, some of the tests that were done in 2013, um, let's see, a detective named Michael Smith, who was one of the detectives associated with this case, he sent off a hairs from that were found at the crime scene that were believed to be from the person that was responsible, to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, in an effort to develop a mitochondrial DNA of the suspect. And he received in 2014 the results back, and they stated that, quote, no hairs suitable for meaningful microscopic comparison purposes and microscopically dissimilar to the hairs in the known sample. They basically got nothing from all of this. So even they're constantly sending stuff off and having it tested or retested in new ways as technology evolves and changes. And so it's there's a lot of persistence in this case, and I know this is one that's not getting a lot of attention, but man, this is 52 years and of, it seems like this is one where there's not big gaps in the investigation. Every year they're doing something that's here, and they finally were able to nail it. So
Well, let's talk about how they got there, because we know that from reading the report that you sent me that they found a suspect. They really liked the suspect, but they didn't have enough to pass that threshold to be able to charge him. And one of the things that they had was a failed polygraph.
yeah.
Do you want to
Yeah,
walk us through of how they first got their eyes on him, and then we'll go to the polygraph?
sure. So one of the things that is difficult very early on, you're mentioning, so today when you're on a college campus, there are cameras everywhere. How can I say this? So if you're, most of the time you don't notice them because you're not paying attention to them. But I know on my college campus there are cameras attached to every single building, and you can kind of, if you wanted to, and or need, if there was a circumstance where you needed to retrace, you could find where people were at anywhere on campus, pretty much. That wasn't the case, of course, in 1973. And so reconstructing Debra Espey's movements was really complicated because they received conflicting accounts about where she was on campus. So the easy thing to say would be, well, maybe let's just check and see if she went to her classes. But the professors, as noted in the report that they interviewed, did not have attendance policy, so they didn't take attendance. So they couldn't tell you who was in the class or who wasn't, because these were fairly large classes. And her classmates gave conflicting information. Some people came forward and said, yeah, I saw her later that afternoon. Some people said, before lunch, I saw her, I think, get into a car with someone, or I saw her on the road outside the campus, I think, hitchhiking. And so there's a lot of conflicting testimony early on that they are sorting through. They do give a lot of polygraphs, and I think that that's interesting. So these people that have accounts of having some kind of eyes on her, they do give polygraphs to many of these individuals. And what ultimately happens is they begin to pare through this testimony, however they are excluding people, and they begin to notice that there is a commonality in a car that comes up in several people's eyewitness testimony, that they saw her interacting either in the car, talking to an individual on the outside of the car, or kind of or conversing with someone who owned a 1968 green Rambler car. So that's very specific. It wasn't a 68 Rambler, but people were saying a green Rambler. And so that comes up in multiple people's eyewitness accounts. And so that really gets investigators interested in the guy that ultimately is going to be responsible. But the other thing that helped was they do bring him down to question him, and he passed his polygraph, every question except for the question that asked if he had anything to do with Debra Espey's murder. So he failed that one.
Clue, right?
Right. He failed that one. I know polygraphs, everyone always says polygraphs are not admissible, and that is true, right? As evidence. But, this is one of those things. These are a really useful tool. And the only person who failed a polygraph is the person that we know now has been definitively established as the person responsible. So there's something to them.
Well, when you've got multiple people saying that the last time they saw her was near this green Rambler,
yeah,
and you happen to drive a green Rambler and you happen to fail a polygraph test, that's a lot of, happens.
And you happen to take the car into the garage a week later to get the front fender repaired, and you also happen to sell it and get rid of it shortly after.
And then he also get rid of his the murder weapon.
Yeah, so there was a tire iron that was found near the scene that's believed to be the weapon that was used to bludgeon her, and when they were able to track down the green Rambler, it was missing. It was missing the tire iron. So, and the kind of excuse that he gave at the time was that something to the effect of, yeah, it didn't really fit very well with the kinds of lug nuts or something that he had. So he didn't really, he had thrown away or got rid of the one that came with the car, and he had bought a different one that worked better. There was some excuse like that didn't really make a lot of sense. It doesn't make sense now. It didn't make sense to investigators at the time. It was a huge red flag. And they really start bringing him in multiple times to question him. They search his property multiple times as well. And right about 3 months into it, he is going to get a lawyer, and they shut down all communication from that point forward. And so
it's just amazing that you've got that much, but they still didn't have enough. But I think from our perspective now, we would say, oh, well, there's got to be his DNA on the lug nut wrench. There's got to be her DNA inside the car.
Right.
There's got to be her blood inside the car. And in 1973, they didn't have all that. They could fingerprint. They could do a test to see what type of blood it was. And like we've talked about it before, our favorite test is a secretor test. So you could be an A positive secretor or a non-secretor, and that kind of limits it down, but it does not pinpoint who this person is.
No, totally. And even looking at the original, some of the original tests they use when they do get a hold of this car and try to process it, the standard is a little bit different. They do note that there are some chemical indications of the presence of blood, but that's about as far as they're able to go. So there wasn't enough of them even to do like a blood typing or things like that they might be able to do by 70s standard. So they have a pretty good idea that there was blood in his car at some point, but whose blood it is, how it got there was just not known. And I think the people at the time, at least it was the implication you get from the report is that, or from the file, is that investigators were convinced that he was responsible. And there's even a notation where the state attorney contacts this individual's attorneys and says, look, encouraging him essentially to cooperate, because he's like, they want to charge you. Like, if it was up to them and without input from us, like, you'd already be arrested. And so what the standard was that the prosecuting attorneys wanted in 1973. I mean, this is something that comes up in our case as well, where it's like I had deja vu kind of reading all of that, where it's like the investigators were right, and they were just like, look, this, like, they're not really, they explore other connections to other possible cases, but they have a really strong idea. Everything is pointing to this individual, but they just don't have the attorney at the time did not believe that there was enough. The prosecuting attorney did not believe there was enough to go to trial. So I'm not really sure what there was, what the kind of threshold would have been, but it's yeah.
Yeah, and we know this from looking into other cases too, that you've got different DAs that will interpret what they believe is enough to charge someone, I guess would be a fair way to say it. Kind of like the Brian Smith case, where some people thought, you know what, there's enough to charge this guy, and other people are like, no, we still need, a few more things. And you're right, like, we ran into the same thing where we look at it from the outside and say, why is this person not being charged? And for whatever reason, that DA just wanted a few more things, I guess.
Yeah, and the guy is ultimately responsible. Ended up living out his full life, well into his 70s. My understanding is he had like grandchildren. He had a successful career. He never had another criminal record. From what little we know right now, at least from the outside, and maybe something will change that, but from the outside, it looks like he had a fairly nice life. And it's a shame, because he was within that community still, mostly in plain sight, and where he lived out his life. And it was always kind of understood that he was responsible. It was just a matter of finding find that connecting link. I'm looking at a report right now, for instance, it said even in 2008, so this is a while back, they are submitting numerous pieces for re-examination. They're constantly submitting pieces for re-examination. And the FBI lab wrote, this is what I was referencing earlier, that even known blood from the victim is now showing no DNA present, indicating the degradation of the evidence, is what the FBI says in their report that comes back. New technologies that are more sensitive would allow them to find DNA and other aspects that were not available before. But it is fascinating that as recently as 2008, speaking about how much this technology can kind of change over a relatively small amount of time, as recently as 2008, they're saying that they can't even find Debra Espey's DNA presence in something that they know is her blood.
Do you know, did Deborah have any living relatives as of today? Is there anyone that
they're deceased? She has someone that she actually has someone who is tied to her family, a sister-in-law. It's interesting because her sister-in-law's name actually is Debra Espey as well. So her sister-in-law name was Deborah. She married Espey's brother, who was alive at the time, who's now deceased. But she married his brother and took his name, so she became Debra Espey as well. So she shares the same name as the victim. She is still alive and is in Florida, but that is her parents are deceased, and the suspect, of course, has been deceased for a number of years.
Do you want to save the suspect's name, or do you want to go ahead and put it out?
Oh no, we can put it out there. His name's Dennis Murphy. So I'm sure we will have a lot more coming in the days. And by the time we get to the next show, we will have a lot more information about Mr. Murphy. But his name was largely redacted in the case file that I had access to. But knowing that, particularly when they're just talking about, because detectives interview him many times, even in the 1980s and 1990s, they are driving to his residence and interviewing him. He's changing his story and telling things that they know are not truthful, and they note that in the report. So this guy is like a walking red flag from
Yeah.
1973 up
And you would
into
think
his
he would
death.
be smart enough just to keep his mouth shut. You know, if you didn't
He
get charged after you lawyered up and after you know that they don't have anything or enough,
Yeah.
never speak to them again.
Yeah, and this is one of the other weird things, and we saw this with Delphi, with Richard Allen, maybe to a less obvious extent,
Right.
but uh but this Dennis Murphy, the guy who's the murderer in this case, he ends up inserting himself throughout the investigation over the years into it. He changes his story about what his relationship to Deborah was, from someone who barely knew her to someone who was friendly with her and would give her rides home, to by the 1980s and 1990s, when detectives are visiting him and questioning him, they're doing these reports saying, essentially he's exaggerated his relationship. He basically says, why would I ever harm the person who was like my closest friend in the world, where he's become like her like closest. He imagines she's like she was his closest friend. So
Right.
his like relationship to her was very fluid and changing. But one of the strange kind of ways that he inserted himself early on in this case was, and I think he just couldn't help himself. And he maybe imagined it made him look smarter, or he was deflecting attention. But he told investigators that he had a feeling that they wouldn't find her alive. This is before her body was
Oh,
found. And that when they found her, that she would probably be found somewhere off the side of the road. Like, he described the crime scene like in real detail. And then when they found her, and it like matched that, he bragged to them, a detective notes. He bragged to them that he was right and that he had predicted the whole thing
so he's
without
psychic. Yeah.
without any kind of irony of recognizing like how incriminating that looks, that he provided so many specific details. And that's what's baffling to me. If you take all, like, maybe any one of those things just looks kind of weird,
Right.
and but you take the totality of like all of these different circumstances surrounding this guy, like he looks guilty as hell. Like, and that's it must have been incredibly frustrating. I'm hoping to touch base with some of the investigators who worked on this soon. And I would love to, like, especially ones that interviewed him in the 80s and 90s. This had to be maddening because he's responsible, right?
Yeah, and you're exactly right that it reminds me of Richard Allen, where it's like they can't help themselves.
Uh-huh.
And same way, he could have probably gotten away with it
Uh-huh.
if he never made a call and reported himself being on the trail that day.
Yeah.
And then he goes in for an interview and starts putting himself at the crime scene,
Uh-huh.
checking the stocks and whatnot. And it's like, okay,
It's
it's just getting worse and worse, you know?
Yeah, and that's the case. And I think that the weird, there are some interesting bits to this case that complicate it. Like I said, there were two other women who were college students, not at this college, but who were 19 and 20 years old, so same kind of age range, who were murdered in this community, which has a fairly low crime rate, and they were murdered in similar ways. And so for a very long time, one of the things the detectives were at least mindful of was there were some calls in the press at the time that, like, are these cases connected? Do we have a serial killer here? You keep in mind this is the 1970s. We're ultimately going to have Ted Bundy in Florida, and people were starting to become more aware, at least, of the idea of serial killers. That term is one that's been, that's not too old at that point, but they're looking for connections between these cases, and the DNA is this week that they've released was able to definitively show that those cases were not connected. But one of the things that law enforcement and kind of exploring every possibility, they're having to like really look in and explore the possibility whether these cases are connected, and they're not. And they conclude they were not without the actual DNA that we have today. But it was something that was curious. I mean, that's what happened in our case too. I mean, you have, what's the odds that someone on the anniversary of the only murders that ever happened on your campus with a low crime rate like disappears, right? Like it's kind of, it just feels like that there, and maybe that's just like our own kind of desire to form connections where they don't exist and create a story that makes sense. But there's that kind of effort to do that. So in this case too.
All right. Well, we will be hearing more from you about that at briansantanaauthor.com. I believe you're going to be getting an article out on this in a few weeks, hopefully.
Yeah. So I'm still kind of making my way through a very extensive case file. And I'm hoping when we come back, we'll be able to touch base about these details and others, and including for those people that are interested in Ted Bundy or any of these other famous serial killers. Ted Bundy pops up in this case. Investigators do explore, based on a tip that comes in, whether Ted Bundy has any connection to Debra Espey.
All right. Well, where can people find you on IG to get updates about what you're doing?
At True Crime Professor is the easiest way to get a hold of me. If you are interested in what's kind of going on, I also have a link on the IG page to briansantanaauthor.com. And so I have a mailing list. Subscribe there. You'll get updates, links to any articles I write, but also just general updates about promotions for Murder on Campus and any updates related to things we're doing with that book or other projects.
All right. Well, if you would like to support both of us, you can pick up a copy of, you know what? I don't mind giving her a plug. That was Julia Cowley's hoodie for the consult. She was on the show last week to talk about the John Benet Ramsey ransom note. Fantastic show. Go check that out. That's available on YouTube and Apple and Spotify, anywhere where you can get a podcast. You can pick up our book, A Murder on Campus, The Professor, the Cop, in North Carolina's most notorious cold case. That is available anywhere where you can get a book, but especially Amazon, Kindle, Audible. And if you go to Santana True Crime, there's links to the show. If you go to Santana True Crime on IG, I've got links to the show as well as a link to the book. And I'm adding other books that we've had on the show. So trying to make it a one-stop shop for everyone that would like a book from an author that came on the show. Brian, thank you so much. Please like and subscribe. Happy New Year and good night.